NatJoins is made up of the SAPS, the NDF, and the State Security Agency. So all of those different agencies will be giving an update. Joining us now in studio is Professor Themba Maseko. He's the head of Wits School of Governance. We've also got Tessa Dooms here with us. She is a political analyst. To both of our guests, welcome. Thanks very much for coming on. And perhaps, Tessa, I can just start off by just reflecting very briefly before we get to the nitty-gritty of our conversation, very briefly on how that briefing was started, this NatJoins update on the state of readiness ahead of SONA, the security issues at play, with a very one-sided Christian biblical approach to the way they chose to inspire the soldiers and the officers there today.
Yeah, I think we often forget that there are these kind of processes within our different entities where there are chaplains, but you would expect that those chaplains are sensitive to the religious plurality that our Constitution requires of us. And so it's not that we forget that people have spiritual and religious sensibilities, but that we are an inclusive society. And I think that that was kind of very jarring to have that kind of focus. And yes, we are a nation that reports about 80% of the country being Christian, but we are committed to a plural society, and I think that was not reflected at all in that. I would be very concerned if that is the way that the police service is going about things.
Yeah, I thought it was jarring as well, and I'd hate for any officer there to feel a sense of being excluded because of their religious beliefs, but be that as it may. I want to get on to the State of the Nation address. It's arguably one of the most important events on our calendar. It's really where the president takes us into his confidence as a nation. He sets out the priorities for the year ahead, and there are many. Perhaps, Prof. Maseko, it'd be good for us to start with how the president would have written this State of the Nation address, and this year, 2025, with the Government of National Unity, how that process might have changed.
Okay, that's a very important question, because we've had a tradition that's been in place now for the past 30 years, and it was largely based on a model of one single party being the governing party.
Right.
So the process would ordinarily be ministries submitting their plans to the presidency, and then the process kicks off with an ANC Lekgotla, and the ANC Lekgotla then leads to a January 8 statement that is read, where the party says this is what they are planning to do. And then the process moves into the government process now, where the different ministries, and remember, we're still talking about where there was one majority party. So these ministries will put their documents together, giving reports of their achievements and their plans for the following year. And those will then be taken to a cabinet Lekgotla, which happens around end of January or somewhere there, where all these reports are consolidated, and then inputs are given to the president's speechwriters, who then consolidate all of this information, and then out of all of that information come up with a theme and a message that is then delivered in the State of the Nation's address. Come 2025, we now have a government of national unity. So the party political process still continued, I suspect. From a government perspective, I do know that there were some challenges, because when ministries were then being called to submit their contributions to a State of the Nation address, to a Cabinet Lekgotla meeting, there were already policy contestations that we saw. We talk about Bela Act, you're talking about the Land Act and all those kinds of things. So you would find submissions being made to a Cabinet Lekgotla with some policy contestations, and we saw one of the members of the GNU already indicating or even threatening to pull out if all of those laws were actually being implemented by government. But that being the case, those reports were submitted to the Cabinet Lekgotla. The Cabinet Lekgotla then made its decisions and sent those to the presidency to produce the State of the Nation's address. And still, issues came up. The health insurance issue came up, and the DA was even threatening to actually pull out of the GNU, which indicates that there were lots of policy contestations, and it needed, I'm sure, a bit of rethinking on the part of the presidency drafters to actually begin to realize that it's no longer business as usual. It's not just listening to what came out of the Lekgotla, ANC Lekgotla, what came out in one specific ministry, but they need to now take into account what the GNU partners have actually come up with. So then the next stage is for the president to actually make the presentation. Now, you would imagine, and I'm told by people working in government, that in fact there will be an attempt for the president to actually convene leaders of the other parties as part of the GNU to brief them about what he was going to announce, what he's going to announce in the State of the Nation address. So, which represents a monumental change. Yeah. Because in the past, all of these parties would have listened, would have arrived in Parliament, hear what the president says, and then after the speech, they then come out and say, this was a useless speech or hopeless, it didn't deal with this and that and that. So in an attempt to get some kind of uniformity within the GNU, I'm told there is an attempt to try and get all of these parties together to say, listen, this is what I'm going to say, any comments?
Yeah, yeah.
But already, I mean, you can assume that it's too late. If the briefing is happening, or if it happens today, it's too late. The speech is already drafted. So the most likely scenario is that the members of the GNU may come out of Parliament, of Parliament after the speech and express support for the overall theme and still raise some reservations. And then there will be those parties that are outside of the GNU who will be attacking the speech as usual. So that's the scenario we should expect tonight.
So the policy contestation part for me, Tessa, is that good news for South Africans ultimately? You know, it's like in a newsroom when we're fighting about what the headlines should be. Ultimately, we should be having these fights about policy to the benefit of citizens. Hopefully that's the outcome.
Well, absolutely. And I would hope that the parties that are emboldened enough to come into the public domain to express their dissatisfaction with these various policies are bold enough to take that into the cabinet room, into the cabinet lekgotla, and not just do it to grandstand to constituents, because that would be the worst possible outcome, where you have a John Steenhuisen very emboldened so that his constituents know that he cares about the things that they care about, but then goes into the room and cowers and doesn't actually bring out those issues. And I do think it's good for democracy in various ways, because I think that around the table of cabinet, you want there to be real contestation of ideas. And I can say I haven't felt in the last 10 to 15 years that you've had a cabinet where you've seen these kinds of different views emerging and real engagement of ideas. And one of the things that I've heard of people who worked in the Mbeki administration was this idea that cabinet was this place for a lot more engagement over a longer period of time. People would speak about, for example, the policy unit that sat within the presidency at that time being a point of policy engagement with the various departments, and there's this kind of back and forth. And again, I think that this brings back that kind of opportunity where, because the ANC has been on the back foot for the better part of the last 15 years, they have kind of, done what they do really well, which is close ranks. Now the closing of ranks has these various complications. And while I personally do not believe the DA at any point when they say they're going to leave the GNU, I always think they're mocking us. Because they stand to gain so much more from being in the space than being outside of it. I think it would take something really dramatic to have the DA walk away from this. But it only matters if they actually take those concerns into the cabinet room.
Right.
It only matters if they are also willing to compromise and they're also willing to negotiate and find middle ground. If parties are going in there and they're saying, well, we're going to have our party stance versus your party stance and we're going to find no middle ground in between, I think that becomes unproductive. That then just becomes about political theater. And we don't need political theater in these times. We need a government that finds each other. We need a government that is able to build what we call a kind of a national consensus on what is minimally acceptable in the country. And if these parties, 10 of them in the GNU, 9 of them in cabinet, if they do not set their party agendas a little bit to the side in order to find a minimum viable agenda for government, they are wasting our time.
Absolutely. We'll talk about the national dialogue that the president announced as well on the Day of Reconciliation on the 16th of December last year. We've not heard much about that 2025 dialogue since the President made that announcement. Tessa Dooms and Themba Maseko are here in studio with us, trying to get through some of the important issues we need to consider ahead of what is a very different State of the Nation address under the Government of National Unity. The President giving that address at 7 o'clock this evening at City Hall. Tessa, you wanted to pick up on, because obviously there's a program of events that happened after the State of the Nation address. We've got the address itself, which is this evening, and then of course next week we've got those 2 days of debate, and then the President will answer the questions of the debate on around the Thursday, I believe it is. And not long after that, we have the budget speech, which will then enact what the President had to say in SONA.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a chicken and egg with the budget and SONA that happens behind the scenes, because the budget is a much longer process than the creation of the SONA speech. So in fact, by about December, the budget is kind of agreed upon in principle. What happens after that is kind of a political process of the presidency kind of prioritizing issues with National Treasury. But the State of the Nation address almost becomes a way to kind of give political will to a budget that is about to come.
Already set.
And so in that sense, if you think about the last 6 months with a government of national unity now and a multi-party government, you would have expected that the political parties coming into this that are not part of the ANC would have used the budget process as a place to start also fighting some of those battles about the program of action. Because on the one hand, there's the policy implications, right, and things that impact on law. And again, a lot of the contestations have been about actually laws. They've been about NHI or the expropriation bill. But then there's policy within government that is programmatic and has budgets attached to it. And there you'd like to see that the different parties have thought about what they want their budget allocations to focus on and where their priorities are on things that they can act on as people in government, not just what Parliament has to do a say. And so I think we're going to see an interesting unfolding. We need to look out, particularly for where the ANC doesn't have the ministerial seats. So, you know, looking at Home Affairs, looking at the Department of Education, Basic Education, looking at the Department of Land, Agriculture, all of those places. What do these different political parties bring in terms of programmatic agenda that might have a budget implication? Because all of last year, although there were new ministers, they were actually still on an old budget. They were on somebody else's budget and somebody else's priorities. It's their time to shine now to say these are our real priorities about the work we're going to roll out our sleeves to do, and that we need budgeted by Treasury and by the presidency. And if they want some battles of significance, it will show in this SONA.
Yeah. If I may come in on that one, I think the budget process is also going to be very interesting in Parliament, because there you're not just talking about the GNU, but you also have those parties that are not part of the GNU. And every minister, be it GNU minister or ANC or DA minister coming to Parliament, they will present their budgets to the budget committees in Parliament. You should expect that a lot of the parties that are outside of GNU are going to be presenting huge resistance, may actually even slow down the process of finalizing the budget, because ultimately the Minister of Finance presents the budget to Parliament. The Parliament must approve that budget. Now, historically, for the past 30 years, it was a given.
Yeah.
An ANC budget, an ANC minister, ANC majority in Parliament, the budget was approved. Whereas now the situation is going to be very interesting. And that's why I think that, in fact, that dynamic in Parliament, not just for budget, but for all policy initiatives, is going to be quite interesting.
Yeah.
Because these parties outside of the GNU are going to want to demonstrate their muscle and say, we're not approving or supporting this budget. But then the GNU can come in and start using its majority to push the budgets through. But there will be contestation. And let's face it, I think that's going to be good for democracy, because in the past, it was a given that the budget is passed, but now ministers are going to have to make sure that their policies are in line with what the budget is actually proposing to do. And they're going to have to be able to justify policy and budget decisions to Parliament, and in doing so, they'll be accounting to the public. So we may see a rising level of accountability on the part of those who are actually in the GNU. And I feel for the public servants, the DGs, who are going to be the officials who are presenting the nuts and bolts of a budget and then having to answer complex questions from the opposition parties that will be in parliament. But it's an interesting development for our democracy.
Yes, it sounds like an incredibly important change in how things are done. As Themba just said before, it was a given. The budget would be passed.
And particularly for the ANC has never been in the position where they have to interrogate a budget, you know, for things they might oppose, right? So, and so this, again, the State of the Nation address is going to be interesting because there may be things in there that the ANC at large may not agree with. They don't know.
Right.
And so when the president brings together the GNU, Fikile might feel like he knows what's going to be in that State of the Nation address today when he comes into that room, but he may actually not. The other thing that's missing going to be a missing step, I believe, in this process is going to be the infamous clearinghouse that Deputy President Paul Mashatile is supposed to be holding, which brings together the GNU partners and supposed to be, you know, dealing with disputes. The time frame for writing the speech just doesn't allow for this dispute resolution and all of that, which means that post the speech, the debates are going to have to be that place. And again, will the GNU partners have the chutzpah, have the courage to go into the debate space and not only say, well, because we're in the cabinet room, we're going to, you know, play nice, but come into the debate space with the courage of being the parliamentarians they need to be. And this is also the big thing that the ANC's dominance has denied us, is that parliamentarians are not in service of cabinet. Parliamentarians' job is to hold cabinet to account regardless of party affiliation. And so now those parliamentarians, because again, we have 18 parties represented in parliament. 10 of them are part of the GNU, 9 of them are in cabinet. If those parties decide that they're going to come in their parliamentary role once this debate has to start around SONA, and they're just going to toe the GNU line, we're going to have a very, very flat, parliament. And I think the opposite needs to be true. I think the parliamentary space, parliamentarians must remember they are not part of the GNU. Each parliamentarian that is not a member of cabinet is not part of the GNU and actually needs to go toe-to-toe with cabinet, toe-to-toe with the presidency, and hold them to account regardless of political affiliation. Because when they take that oath, they do not take an oath to their party, they do not take the oath to the cabinet or to their ministers, they take an oath to the republic to be on the side of the people.
Absolutely.
If the MPs do their job, this is going to be the most robust parliament and the most accountable cabinet if that happens.
And if you've forgotten that, just look at the state capture report, right? The oversight part of parliamentary, being in parliament.
I want to underscore the point you're making because we talk about the government of national unity, but that's cabinet, that's the executive.
We've got 2 minutes, Themba.
But 2 minutes, and then parliament is a people's parliament. So ANC members, DA and Nora, when they walk into that house, they are representing citizens, not the government. So.
Is that not a given? Do we not know that as MPs walking into parliament?
History has told us that, in fact, the MPs themselves did not understand that. They saw themselves as defending cabinet in parliament.
Yeah. And they saw themselves as defending their party bosses because, remember, our electoral system says it's the party that deploys the MP, and the MP doesn't feel like the rest of us can hire or fire them.
It's your employer, essentially. Tessa Dooms, Professor Themba Maseko, we're a bit tight for time. Thanks so much for being with us this afternoon.
Thanks for having us.
We've got your headlines at 1 o'clock as we continue with our build-up to the State of the